Of all the earnest games we play in life, the earnest game of personality, aka the Enneagram of personality, is perhaps the most fascinating and arguably the most useful game to get to know. The premise behind the Enneagram is infinitely complex as well as incredibly simple. Here's a simple way of putting it. Our personality style, our egoic engine, our I think, I feel, I want, I need, are all forms of gameplay that we've been refining since childhood. The core game, and this is the earnest part of it, basically boils down to how do I survive being me? Me in this family, me in this social group, me in this realm of existence that we call human. The Enneagram, this fundamental understanding of what makes each me tick and persist, gives shape to some of the answers we have about our earnest games, about ourselves, often arrived at unconsciously through trial and error, but also as a kind of channeling or working out process. Equally at times a distortion of our essence, our particular flavor of life force. Let's call it, a survival strategy that we unconsciously came up with to try and win against death, disconnection, meaninglessness, as opposed to losing at or suffering those existential spoilers. So, 9 egoic strategies, 9 earnest games, 9 ways of saying I am. Because when we talk about the ego or the personality or even just me, we're talking about our game. The I or me here is the game. The moves we make to be seen, to feel safe, to matter, to belong, to be loved, to stay intact are all earnest games that we play, often with great sincerity, but for the most part, completely unbeknownst to us. The Enneagram doesn't try to stop the game or tell us how to play it. It simply helps us notice which aspects of ourselves, which roles, patterns, moves we're especially identified with. The roles, patterns, moves that we're convinced we have to play, and maybe also a little bit afraid of what might happen if we stopped playing it that way. What if, for example, we looked up and realized that we've been pouring all of our time and energy into Monopoly and suddenly decided to switch to Trivial Pursuit instead? That would be like shifting, let's say, from a self-preservation 3 game, all sort of strategy, achievement, image and momentum, to something more like a sexual 5 game, where the goal isn't to win at a social or material level, but to deeply understand and master some kind of underlying system, seeking intellectual depth and complexity rather than external validation or security. And that's kind of what I'm going to be doing here, switching games on purpose each week for 9 weeks or a little bit more. I'm going to attempt to live completely as a different Enneagram type. To do this, I will step into the other types' rules for playing their life game, their rules for living, their priorities, their worldview, their internal psychology, and in so doing, make a genuine attempt to give up my usual strategies and try on theirs. Not just in theory, but in practice, in how I think, plan, speak, relate, dress, move, and respond to others and myself. I'm not going to be just studying the types or interacting with them as when, playing a role like the role I play as a psychotherapist. Instead, I'm going to be acting or manifesting each Enneagram personality type from the inside, inhabiting the other type's game as if it were my own, to see what breaks, what shifts, and what reveals itself when I stop being me. Think of it as a kind of inner world expedition, a method acting thought experiment, a chance to see what goes on when we stop being ourselves on purpose. We're always told to know ourselves, to be true to ourselves, but what if the self we're being true to is just a script that we've learned through the various accidents and adaptations of living our lives up to now. A role we've got, very, very good at playing in a kind of lifelong typecast setup. I mean, think Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau, or Hugh Grant as the charmingly flustered romantic, or I don't know, maybe Joe Pesci as the short-tempered wild card, right? Roles that we most likely started playing when we were around 5 or 6 years old, maybe even earlier, and have spent all of the time since rehearsing, refining, and most importantly, defending this self. As in, well, I'd never do that kind of thing because I'm this kind of person, or I like things done properly, I can't help it, or I get restless if I feel stuck in one thing. I've always had to hold it together for everyone else. I'd rather keep the peace than start an argument. I mean, these are all games, right? The Enneagram shows us how much of our inner world is kind of scripted, predominantly as a sort of survival story, but also as a sort of one-man or one-woman show or YouTube channel, which has served us in our lives, probably, as well as any earnest game can. But like all games, the 9 earnest games of the Enneagram have their upsides and they have their downsides. None of the 9 lives, the 9 games, is necessarily the best game, which is to say the one most likely to bring us to peace, freedom and contentment. Each game, each personality style has its advantages, its blind spots, its compulsions and its costs. And one major downside to playing these games as we do is that we can become trapped in the sort of recursive logic of each game, trapped in the ego cage, as I like to call it, where we benefit often profoundly from having whichever one of the 9 core identities we cling to, giving us a sense of coherence, a sense of control, maybe even safety. No wonder we don't switch things up once we found our game. But we can also understandably suffer from the limitations of these self patterns, their rigidity, their sort of looping or loopy justifications, their kind of outright refusal by and large to let anything truly new or other influence us. It's a refusal ultimately to let us be. If you're playing Hamlet, you can't suddenly become Mercutio, right? Or maybe you can. If you're always Rachel, you can't suddenly become Phoebe, unless this is done in a hyper-conscious and very deliberate kind of way. And even then, Rachel playing Phoebe would still be Rachel playing Phoebe. The pattern, the patterns of our character might shift, but the underlying self, the essence, its essential egoic flavor, we might say, remains. So if we've built our whole personality around being the chill, agreeable one, we don't just wake up one day and start saying no, unless we want to risk a minor or a major identity earthquake. If you're the overachiever, the helper, the rebel, the peacemaker, then deviating from the script won't just feel weird, it will feel like we are wrong, like, breaking character. But what if that's what we need? What if that's what I need? For even though I am, now an expert on my Enneagram 4 game and understand fully the trade-off of being this type, I am still stuck in many, many ways in my particular ego cage, in the sort of the self-defeating bullshit of being an Enneagram 4. And true to type, I find this somewhat depressing. The thing is, once you know your Enneagram number, once you really know it, you also know the hidden rules for that type, right? The underlying code that's been shaping your choices, your reactions, your desires, and your avoidances all along. This is what the Enneagram, was for me anyway. Like someone who'd been listening, someone who'd been playing music by ear their whole life, and then is suddenly handed the sheet music and goes, oh, okay, so that's the difference between a major and a minor chord, right? Or, oh, right, so I'm jazz and you're hip hop, and okay, similarities and differences. And this is why also, and how it came about, origin stories. Or maybe it's just like finding this like well-worn script kind of tucked into your jacket pocket and noticing for the first time that you have been mouthing the same lines for decades. And trust me, in an intrinsic way, I have been doing this. We all have. At our core egoic level, we are predictable, repetitive, and patterned creatures. No one really wants to hear this, but it's true. We've built these patterns to survive, but they often keep us stuck in the same old unchanging loops. The same old Groundhog Day self, despite the therapy, the inner work, all of that, which is frustrating, baffling, and something I see happening in myself and others all the time. But maybe that's also where the potential for noticing and trying out some new stuff might lie. Every Enneagram personality style comes, as it were, with its own user's manual. Not just for how it operates, but for what it fears, what it wants, what it compulsively repeats, and what it's blind to. And this means we can start to read the fine print on our own behavior. We can now see which parts of us are maybe, automatic, functioning on autopilot, and which elements of the human experience might still be up for grabs. You would think, I certainly think this, both as an Enneagram nerd and as a psychotherapist directly involved in the earnest game of trying to assist others with their selfing, that everyone would love to have this user's manual, the Enneagram, or at least a decent inner game playing guide to consult. But this doesn't seem to be the case, at least not in my experience. And I've now talked about the Enneagram with hundreds of people. Many find it exhilarating, illuminating, almost spooky in its accuracy. But many just squirm or shrug or, politely change the subject. Because a manual implies that that we are somewhat determined, which is to say not entirely driven by free will or pure choice. A game implies that we are playing at something or being played. And understandably, not everyone is ready to confront that reality. So how am I going to set this up? Well, it starts with me sitting down and doing a very thorough life MOT. So this involves explaining to GPT how I am currently living my life, my routines, my daily habits, my work projects, the areas in life where I feel existentially stuck, struggling, suffering. Basically, over the course of an hour or so, I will give GPT a very detailed snapshot of my current life, how I live it, what motivates me, all through the lens of being, I guess, this sort of, one-on-one Enneagram sexual 4 type, as the subtype is known, with a 5 wing. And then once I upload this life snapshot, I then present the premise of my experiment to the AI, ask it to generate for me a kind of comprehensive manual for how I might live the next week, month, year, whatever, of my life, as if I were a different personality type, but with the same core identity. Same core identity, radically different agendas and strategies in terms of living with and managing myself. And I'm going to start with Enneagram 1, which is going to be a real challenge for me as a type who identifies as a 4. 4s run on feeling, on mood, on aesthetic intuition, baby. And 1s run on principle, on discipline, and a clear sense of right and wrong. So where I tend to follow, intensity, authenticity, my fellow 1s follow, whether they like it or not, and like doesn't often come into the equation, unfortunately, miserable, structure and order. That's what they're following. So basically it's going to be like handing the steering wheel to my inner critic for a week and asking him to drive. So will this loopy, self-referential, emotionally indulgent, navel-gazing, chaos-flavoured Enneagram 4, that's me, make it through a whole week of being an Enneagram 1? Will he implode? Will he find salvation in a spreadsheet? If you like the idea of this premise, you know what to do, ding dong, bing bong, and let's play some earnest games.
Calling all the sunbeams, meet up in the breezeway, gather in the naked light of God. milky as the sunset.